Kisu Kiukit, good day, and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're honored to have with us today Vernon Finley, who works on language curriculum for the Kootenai Culture Committee, the Department of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, charged with the preservation, protection, and perpetuation of the language and culture of the Kootenai or Kootenai people. Mr. Finley is the son of Tony Finley, who is Salish, and Susan Huencorn, who is Kootenai. He was raised in Dayton with his grandparents, Jerome and Mary Huencorn. Before working at the Kootenai Culture Committee, Vernon worked for the bilingual education program here at Salish Kootenai College. Mr. Finley earned his PhD in education at the University of Georgia. Welcome, Vernon, and thanks for taking the time to be with us. So you're working on language curriculum for the Kootenai Culture Committee.
Yes.
Maybe start by telling us a bit about the Kootenai language.
Well, the Kootenai language is considered a language isolate, which means it's unrelated to any of the other languages in the world. There have been, linguists that studied it that have tried to make the connections. Linguists, for whatever reason, want to try to put all of the native languages into certain family groups and show how it's related to other languages. And there are a few that are isolates that they haven't been able to connect with any other language, and Kootenai is one of them.
And it's spoken by the Kootenai community here on the Flathead Reservation, and this is one of 7 bands, is that correct?
Right, right. There is the Ksanka here, and then there's the Bonners Ferry over in northern Idaho, and then there are 5 Canadian bands.
And what's the status of the language today in these various Kootenai communities?
Well, the number of fluent speakers has been dropping really dramatically just because the age of the fluent speakers is quite advanced, and so in all of the communities. There was a period of time not that long ago, within the past 10 years, the Ksanka here probably had the most language resources as far as elder fluent speakers of any of the bands. And that has just about reversed itself at this point to where the Canadian bands currently have more speakers than we do. We've lost a tremendous amount of resources in the last 5 years even.
And is that just, are there more quite elderly people alive in the Canadian bands, or are there more younger fluent speakers?
There are, I think about the youngest fluent speakers are kind of middle-aged, maybe there are a few who are my age and older. I'm not fluent by any means, but and I rely heavily on the few fluent speakers that we have left here now. But there are some elders. They seem to have more elders when they're all pulled together. Of course, there's 5 bands to draw from up there, but there seems to be more elders up there that are fluent speakers than here now.
I see. And are there significant differences in the dialect spoken by the different Kootenai bands?
Surprisingly, not as much as you would think. When there are slight pronunciation differences, some of the stories have been preserved a little bit differently between the Canadian bands and the American bands, but surprisingly not as many differences as you would expect. At the fluent, from a fluent speaker's standpoint, they understand each other perfectly well.
Even the 2 most distant bands from each other would have no problem conversing.
Right.
That's interesting, because I know in the Salish language family, that's true for the closer bands, but as you go further and further away, the Coast Salish are quite different in the dialect from the Salish spoken.
The sounds might be the same, but the meanings are different?
I'm no language expert, so I better not go too far with that. I just know that it's from what I understand from the elders, if they were speaking to each other, they'd have a hard time understanding each other. But that's for the most distant ones.
Level of fluency also is a pretty important thing to consider. You know, there are some who can function in a conversation, but for my purposes, as far as trying to preserve the language and trying to develop accurate materials and materials that reflect the wide complexities of the language, the fluent speakers are pretty rare. In the last, for example, Charles Huoncorn was probably our most fluent and literate speaker that we had here on the reservation. Besides him would be Sarah Buffton, and then Charlie's wife, Alice. And Adeline Matthias was very fluent, you know, spoke high levels of the language but wasn't literate. She couldn't write it and spell it correctly. So the real value to us now and the real value, you know, in the future is not only to have recordings of those real high-level speakers like Adeline, but to also have the people who are literate. You know, Alice could sit there and listen to these higher forms of the language and know exactly what they're saying and tell you, know, and repeat it back to you and spell it for you correctly, so that, you know, it's preserved accurately for the future. So that's the real value of where we're at. Yeah. If we look at the condition of the language right now, you know, by the loss of the resources in the last few years, in the last several years, comes the realization that our language is forever changed. Our language is it's hurt pretty bad. It's there will never be someone, at least in the near future, with the level of fluency of, say, Alice Huoncorn. You know, it's that level of understanding. You know,
that's difficult to face, isn't it?
It's very difficult when we think about the few of us who are trying our best to learn the language, and to know that by the time our resources are gone, we can never get to that. We can never get anywhere close to the level of fluency where they're at.
And why is that? Is that because to really acquire that deepest level, you have to be raised with it as your first language, or?
That helps. That certainly helps an awful lot, because then it's the way that you think, the way that you perceive, the way that you see the world is you know, it's set. You know, the way you view everything is set in your first language, and it certainly helps them. You know, it helped them the most. To be able to, the level of fluency that I would like to see us get to would be where, you know, not only literate or using high forms of the language, but being able to come up with new words. You know, when we've just recently been working on redoing the hymns and prayer book, and in looking at the prayers and the hymns, and looking at the words that were used in English in those prayers and hymns, and then what was come up with in Kootenai, it's not an exact, you know, one-for-one translation, but it's a way of expressing the idea that there was a level of fluency among the people. They could sit there, and when the priest or whomever said, this is the sentiment expressed in this prayer or in this sentence, they could come up with the correct way of expressing that sentiment in the Kootenai language, you know.
That's so fascinating. I mean, because between the Catholic religion and Kootenai spirituality, there's probably an enormous cultural gap as well, and you're trying to translate or communicate across not only languages but cultures.
You know, it's my own theories about that, but I was thinking about that I thought about that an awful lot, about why, why is it that an elder could express a deep concern and the number one drive in their life is to preserve the culture, and then at the same time use Catholic prayers and hymns as an expression of the culture also. And so in looking at how those two ideas are, reconciled with one another in their own minds, that's been really, revealing. And my own theories are that they didn't perceive Catholicism the way Catholics did, and they used it as another way of continuing on, furthering their worldview, their way of practicing spirituality. It was just another way. The border between the Kootenays and the Pondereys overlapped, and there was a lot of intermarriage between the Pondereys and the Kootenays. And so whenever a Ponderey married a Kootenai and came to live among the Kootenai, they learned the language, they did, they participated in everything. And whenever they would go and practice or participate in someone else's ceremonies, they would come in there. There was enough of an individuality about it that they could come in there and they could do the ceremony from their own place, from their own worldview, from their own background, from their own perspective. They could ask for their help in their way, and that was okay. And it was okay for everybody to do that. And that's the same thing they did when the priests came. They would sit in Mass and they would ask from an Indian perspective, even though the priest thought they was throwing all of that away and supplanting it with what they had.
I mean, it's fascinating how these conversations about language, when they go to any depth at all, inevitably lead to these questions in the history about these exchanges. In the Salish and Ponderey, I've always been convinced that when the missionaries came, it's kind of what you're talking about these very different ideas of the exchange from the two sides. The missionaries came with the idea that they were going to replace Salish Ponderey spirituality with Catholicism, and I think Salish and Ponderey people at the time considered they were adding to what they already had, not replacing.
Yeah, right.
So there was always that difference of intent, I guess.
Right. And at that very first generation of the contact, no harm done, no foul, because they did it. But then you go through generations of that, and you combine that with the loss of the language and replacing the language in other components of the culture. Then a few generations down the road, then you've got confusion about, well, am I Catholic or am I Kootenai?
Well, let me back up just for a second here, because it's a question I probably should have asked at the outset, but for those viewers who may be unfamiliar with the Kootenai language or native languages in general, how would you explain to them the importance of it, why it matters, what it means?
Well, kind of, for the most part, it would have to do with what we started out talking with, because it's an isolate. Because when we were first placed here on the earth, we were, when human beings were first put here on the earth, there were places on the earth where that were original, and all of the others kind of grew and they developed, when they can connect them with language families and all of this, it's somewhere in there they started from and branched out from there. With language isolates, it was one of those original human cultures that were placed here initially, and to lose any of those,
it's kind of a world heritage in a way. It's a world heritage resource.
And the way of expressing things is just, there's already been so much lost in the language. And I was reading about, when I was telling you about the for example, the level of fluency that was just common in the community, where they were able to translate prayers and hymns, were able to sit there with the priest and say exactly how to express something. At that level, the people who were doing that at that time, and I was reading some of those interviews with the people that were that fluent at that level, and my grandfather was an interpreter as a young man for the elders who were doing that. And the things that they would say, that those elders were saying, the language is so different than, I mean, our ancestors, our grandparents would be ashamed at the level that we use the language. It has changed so much.
And this is your grandparents saying.
And this was, my grandfather was a young man interpreting for elders who were saying that.
This. Wow.
It
reminds me of going through some of the ethnographic materials collected by James Tate right after the turn of the century. And in the tapes at the Salish Pend Oreille Culture Committee, much the same thing is said by the elders. Well, we'll do our best, but we're 50 years too late. But then in 1909, Tate records elders saying the same thing, saying the people 100 years ago really knew something.
Yeah, and what I think what they were referring to, what was lost, is the language was so much spoken in metaphor, so much spoken. Everything was, was that there was abstract meanings to everything. There could be words that you would use that, have a literal meaning, but there's this abstract spiritual part of it that is also connected to it, to using the exact, and the wisdom, the wise ones of being able to speak that way. That's what they were talking about, what's missing. Because if we look at the way that we're learning the language now, we're looking at it at a very concrete level.
I see.
A literal translation, when,
We'll have to take a quick break right now for 1 minute. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back. We're continuing our conversation here with Vernon Finley of the Kootenai Culture Committee, who works on language curriculum for the committee. And Vernon, before the break, we were talking about some of the history of language loss, some of the importance of retaining the language. Maybe we could talk for a few minutes now about what you're doing to try to save the language.
Well, we're trying to do some materials. I was mentioning earlier that we've got the revised version of the hymns and prayer book, and although there was this, conflict that we was that I was thinking about earlier, in actuality, the way that they translated the prayers and the hymns is a real valuable language learning tool. Not so much for my purposes, so much for the Catholic part of it, but for the use as a language learning tool. The other parts that we're doing, we've got curriculum books and developing materials to go with each of the lessons from the beginning up to some basic conversations. And those are in the works also. We've got, those publications are very near going to press also, and so this coming year we're looking at some pretty exciting things happening as far as materials development. The other part that I think is the most the most valuable or the most important part that we do. Our linguist Dorothy Burney is working with some of the fluent speaking elders, Alice Hewancorn and Catherine and Louise Andrew and Matt Michelle, Sarah Buffton, working with some of the fluent speakers and taking a lot of the stories, the historical stories, as well as the coyote stories, etc., that are we have on file. We have recordings of a lot of those stories that were recorded from the 1970s on, and transcribing them, translating them and transcribing them and putting them, accurately spelled, accurately written, and everything to go along with the recordings. And
so that'll be a great teaching resource as well, that
right.
material. And when you write it, for those viewers who aren't familiar, you're using a form of the International Phonetic Alphabet, isn't that right?
Right. It was adapted. Specifically for the Xanca language here on the reservation. But yeah. So
how long has that been used now?
It started. I believe it came about in the 70s when they started writing it down. Nancy Joseph was one who really started working hard at trying to get things written and accurately, and she was a fluent speaker back then, working with the Culture Committee, and so she was one of the first ones to really start working on writing it down.
And is the same written system used by all the Kootenai bands, the ones in Canada as well?
Right. The only difference that I see between our writing style here and the alphabet we use here and the alphabet they use in Canada is the symbol we use for the glottal stop. It's just slightly different, and that's all.
We've only got a few minutes left, but are there a lot of young people as students that you see really interested in learning Kootenai and jumping into it?
It's pretty interesting. There's so many of us. I was one of Nancy's students when she was trying to teach us the language, Nancy Joseph, back in the 70s, and I'm not fluent. And a lot of us have been at it for a long time and are nowhere near fluent. I guess what it's really going to take is, on our part, is a dedication to do it every day. And that's the only way we're going to get there. We're never going to get there one day a week or 2 days a week. Yeah. It's going to have to be something we're going to actually commit to every day and before we'll get there.
And with so few speakers left now, it's much more difficult to get that kind of immersion experience that's so crucial to really mastering a language, isn't it?
Absolutely. There are only a few speakers who will attempt to do conversation. Catherine Andrew is great. She would prefer to come in and greet and do short sentences, do short conversations in the language. And so she's always kind of, trying to draw us into that. And that's what we need. That's what, in addition to the depth of the resources that we can get from the other speakers that were literate, we need that conversant part as well. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry we're so short on time. We'll just have a couple minutes left here, but I know that down in the Cusick-Usk community in eastern Washington on the Kalispell Reservation, they're doing some pretty exciting curriculum development stuff there. My understanding is they're going to have 3 levels of curriculum, and when you get out the other end successfully, the idea is that you'll be fluent enough to then really carry on a conversation with an elder.
Right, and that's kind of where we're hoping to get to, probably similar levels. I never compared our levels with what they're doing there, and I participated with them, and we try to steal materials back and forth, and
Good.
So all Indian tribes should be doing that, should be looking at what everybody else is doing, and anything you're not doing that they're doing, that's a good idea. Steal it and use it.
Absolutely. Well, it's not stealing if they let you take it, is it? Well, yeah. I mean, that's an exciting thing, because I guess their idea is then from the school learning, you'll be advanced enough to really get your education from the elders directly.
Right. Well, stealing is a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for the correction. Well, Vernon, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I only wish we had a little bit more time to continue this conversation. Lemdamsh. And I would say it in Kootenai if I knew how.
Oh, sukil Kootenai.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for being with us today. We hope to see you next week. So long.